Labyrinths is brought to you by Knox Robinson Productions. Please consider becoming a patron. For as little as $5 a month, you can listen to Labyrinths ad-free.
Visit patreon.com/Knox Robinson to learn more.
Feeling lost?
Then you're in the right place.
I'm Amanda Knox.
And I'm Christopher Robinson.
And this
is Labyrinths. Today we have something of a special episode. No guest as usual, but we will be talking about a labyrinth. The one Amanda is still somehow trapped in. There have been some recent developments in this saga that you may or may not be aware of. If you don't recall, Amanda was convicted not only of murder, but of criminal slander against her boss, Patrick Lumumba, for the statements she signed in her initial interrogation. In 2015, she was exonerated for the murder charge, but not for the slander charge. It was only in October of this year that her slander conviction was overturned, and she was sent back to the appellate court for retrial. So as of right now, she's a defendant again. Nearly 17 years after her arrest, she is still facing criminal charges in Italy. The other recent development is that Rudy Guede, the man who murdered Meredith Kercher, was arrested on charges of sexual assault and domestic violence against a young woman he began dating after his early release from prison in 2021. As you might imagine, Amanda has received many interview requests about both of these subjects, but she has declined nearly all of them. In lieu of offering what would inevitably become sound bites, we thought we'd have a more intimate and long-form conversation here on Labyrinths about both of these developments. Now, some of you may be very familiar with how Amanda's interrogation went down back in 2007 and how she was coerced by police into signing false statements that implicated herself, which led to her arrest and which derailed the entire investigation. And Amanda did go into a good bit of detail about that interrogation on her recent appearance on Making Sense with Sam Harris. So if you're coming here from Sam's podcast, or if you're already well-versed in this story, just be aware of what you're getting into in this outlier of an episode. And if you want a more classic Labyrinths experience, we suggest you jump around in our back catalog or start at the beginning. Nearly every episode is evergreen. We've made miniseries within Labyrinths about topics like infertility, pregnancy, psychedelics, and the ethics of true crime. We've told stories of adventure with guests like mountaineer Allison Levine, number 47, and ocean rower Roz Savage, number 52. We've gotten into some morally complex territory, like in episode 14, Defending a Monster, where we interviewed Olympic doctor Larry Nassar's defense attorneys. Or episode 7 with Yasmin Mohammed, where we looked at how she escaped an arranged marriage to an Al-Qaeda operative and asked bigger questions about the influence of fundamentalist Islam. And we've gotten nerdy with our Star Trek heroes, like LeVar Burton, episode 13, and Brent Spiner, number 32. We're still hoping to get Patrick Stewart on here someday. That being said, if you are curious about the intricacies of how Amanda's slander charge came about, what this new trial will focus on, and what Amanda thinks about the recent charges against Rudy Guede, then have we got the long, intimate conversation for you. Well, Italy is still not over.
Yeah, it's not over. Yeah. For anyone who's listening, Chris has a very bad cold.
Yeah. I'm going to be a little stuffy this episode, but...
Also, I'm holding a baby.
Yes.
Who may or may not make baby noises.
It's not over.
In a very real sense, this is not over because back when I was definitively acquitted in 2015 of the murder and rape and falsifying a burglary scenario, there were a bunch of charges. I was acquitted of all those charges and definitively exonerated. What I wasn't definitively exonerated of was slander. And I was definitively convicted of slander and sentenced to 3 years time served for that offense, which is considered criminal in Italy. And that slander conviction was in relation to a series of statements that I signed while in police custody that were the result of a all-night interrogation. It was honestly an interrogation that really went on for 5 days, but ultimately the final confession took place overnight, 5 days after the discovery of Meredith's death. And it led to my arrest and the beginning of this whole long legal saga for me. I signed 2 statements, one at 1:45 a.m. on November 6, 2007, and another at 5:45 a.m. on November 6, 2007. I subsequently wrote a few handwritten statements in the aftermath of that, attempting to recant those statements that I signed. But yes, so those statements implicated myself, my boyfriend Raffaele Sollecito, and my boss Patrick Lumumba in the crime of Meredith's murder. So that's the short answer to that. The short answer to this whole legal saga is that I remained wrongly convicted of slander. And I say wrongly convicted because my argument is that I was coerced into signing those statements, and I never intended to implicate myself or others in a crime that I didn't commit, but that I was gaslit and brainwashed by police into doubting my own sanity and going along with what their version or their theory of the crime was at that time.
So this is the thing that has haunted you and has impacted your reputation all these years later, despite your acquittal.
Yes, many people point to that slander conviction as proof that I'm a liar and I'm an unsavory person and that I have something to hide and I've never told the full truth about what happened to Meredith, and only somebody who was involved in the crime would ever even make statements that implicated themselves and others. So,
I mean, I remember, I think shortly after the Netflix documentary came out in 2016, you did an interview for NPR, and the NPR host asked you about that interrogation, and he said, "Do you think you falsely accused a black man because you were subconsciously racist?"
Yes, I remember that. I remember being really surprised by that statement because, of course, people would automatically think, okay, a white woman implicated a black man in this crime that he had nothing to do with. Obviously, that has to do with racism. It didn't. It just so happened to be that my boss at the time was a black man named Patrick Lumumba, and I was supposed to work the night that Meredith was murdered, and he had sent me a text message that evening saying that I didn't have to come into work. And so I texted him back saying, okay, great, have a good night. And that text message was then the thing that the police used to say, we know that you went out that night, because they mistranslated it. So Patrick only came up in this interrogation because the police were going through my text messages, and they told me that in my text message exchanges, there was proof that I had met with this person named Patrick the night of the murder. And so that's the only reason he came up at all, was because of my text message.
So you've talked about this interrogation a lot in various venues over the years.
It's not my favorite thing to talk about. I'll say that.
Just the bullet points of this, from my perspective, that really matter are 5 days of questioning, 53 hours. I like to point out that, that's an overtime work week. Imagine that you go to work for an entire week, and every hour that you're there, your boss is asking you the same questions over and over. And when you give them your answer, they just say no. And they keep asking you the same questions. Like, that would make anybody crazy, right? But on top of that, you're 6,000 miles from home. You're alone.
My roommate just got murdered.
Your roommate's been murdered. The killer's on the loose. You don't have a apartment or house to stay in because your house is now a crime scene. You speak Italian about as well as a 10-year-old, maybe?
That's how I've tried to describe it, but I think that the important thing is that I had a very limited vocabulary as well. So being asked to describe in detail what my house looked like when I came home, or to even understand who I was talking to in the police station. I didn't know what the word for prosecutor was. I didn't know what the word for, any legalese was
Yeah.
completely out of my grasp. So I just made the best translation in my head possible, and that left me misunderstanding the police a lot. And it also led to the police misunderstanding me quite a lot.
Right. So, not out of any desire to get you, but out of a hunch that they think you are covering for somebody. They think that you maybe witnessed something and that you're not coming clean. That hunch, based on perhaps a cross-cultural misunderstanding of how you're reacting to the situation.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of this might be that Italians are very, very expressive with shock and with grief, and they use their hands, and their tears are very prominent for a situation like this. And they found you more reserved and cold, a little more numb.
Yes. The way that I was characterized by the police later on was that I was cold, uncaring, and at times even flippant, when in reality, I was in shock, and I was both numb at times, like I couldn't even believe what was happening. And at other times, I did what is a bad habit I've learned in the future, but I try to please people around me when I'm uncomfortable. And in uncomfortable situations, I try to make people feel better. And oftentimes I try to do that with levity or with humor. And it was not appreciated.
So on that final night, the police, we learn later, have tapped your phone. And they know that you've spoken to your mom and that your mom is coming to Italy.
Is literally on a plane.
She's on a plane.
Yeah.
And she's been telling you for days, I think you should leave. I worry that you're not safe there. I think you should go to Germany and stay with your aunt, at least until this is resolved.
I even bring this up to the police and tell them that my family members are telling me this, and they tell me specifically to not leave the country because I'm, quote, important to the investigation.
And you trust them.
Yes.
You believe them.
Yes. I had no reason not to.
The police are the authorities. Why wouldn't you trust them?
Yeah. I mean, at this point, it was them and Raffaele that were keeping me safe. So I trusted them. And I did everything that I was told to do.
So they've recorded every conversation they've had with you. And every time you've been in the police station, even when you're not officially being questioned, but you're just, in a room talking with Raffaele by yourself, they're recording that.
Yeah, it's been...
Right.
There is, yeah.
You don't know all of this, but...
I don't know this at the time, but
they're
yes.
recording it. And then this final night, you come into the police station with Raffaele, who's been asked in for questioning, and you have nowhere to go, and you don't feel safe in his apartment by yourself. So you come into the police station, and they say, "Oh, you're here. You might as well answer some more questions."
So I go in and I submit to questioning again. And this goes on for a long time. And I don't want to go into all the details of the whole ordeal because I've talked about it at length before. The overall gists of it are that they started to question my memory. They said that I wasn't remembering things correctly. And eventually, a few hours into this, they come to me and say that Raffaele has contradicted what I say happened the night of the murder, and that I can't possibly be remembering things correctly. And then a police officer who has arrived late in the discussion.
This is like after midnight here?
Oh, yeah. Who is operating as a translator, but who is in fact a police officer, tells me that she once was in a car accident that was so bad that she blacked out. She just remembered driving and then waking up in the hospital. And she suggested to me that that's what happened to me, that I had no memory of leaving Raffaele's house that night, and instead just remembered being with Raffaele and then waking up with Raffaele. And in that in-between time, I had gone back to my house with Patrick, and he had done something so horrible that I had blacked it out. I had amnesia, trauma-induced amnesia. And after hours of being questioned and made to feel crazy and being lied to, I started to think that that was what must have happened, because the only thing I remembered was that I spent the night with Raffaele. But if he was saying that I left, and if the police are saying they had proof that I had met up with Patrick, then I must have blacked something out. And
you're logically trying to connect the dots here.
Yes.
You believe the police that they have proof of you being there. You believe them when they tell you that Raffaele says you weren't with him that night.
Yes.
And so how could it possibly, if those things are true, and if your memory is that you spent the night at Raffaele's, then something's got to give here.
Yes. And so I assumed that my sanity was giving, and I adopted what they suggested, which was that I had blacked out from having witnessed something horrible. But then they asked me to remember this horrible thing that I must have witnessed, and I couldn't. I just couldn't for the life of me remember whatever horrible thing I supposedly had blacked out. And so I desperately tried to piece together disparate images in my mind to account for it. And the only thing I was able to piece together were these statements that I then signed that were written by the police, a sort of them trying to make sense of this gobbled, confused sort of montage of images that I was able to piece together.
Yeah, if you go back and read those statements, even the versions the police typed up are largely incoherent, and they are based on an even more incoherent rambling that they prodded Amanda into spewing out.
And
right?
notably, I didn't ever, even in those statements, say that I witnessed the murder. At no point was I able to imagine even witnessing the murder. The only thing I was able to gobble together was an image of the street outside Raffaele's house, or an image of my boss, Patrick the Mumba, or an image of my living room. I was never able to imagine or, quote, remember the crime itself. And they were like, well, don't worry, your memories will come back with time. So they wrote up these statements, had me sign them.
I mean, you're skipping out on them slapping you in the back of the head here.
Well, yes, there was also people slapping me on the back of the head, yelling at me, all of that.
Shouting, remember.
Yeah. And so that was the 1:45 a.m. statement.
After they type that up and ask you to sign it, do they then congratulate themselves? Or are they yes, we've solved this case? What's their attitude?
Yeah, so they were high-fiving each other, and there was a lot of excitement, a lot of them rushing out to go arrest Patrick. And I was left in that room sort of bewildered and confused. And I sat there for a while until the prosecutor came.
And so he comes in, but you don't even know he's the prosecutor. You think he's the mayor or something?
Yeah, they told me that he was the Público Ministero, which I did not know what that meant. I just heard Público Ministero, public minister, and I assumed that it was the mayor or someone like that who was supposed to be there as an official representative.
Someone who was there to help you.
Yes, I assumed it was someone who was there in my defense, or as someone to support me. And in fact, he was the prosecutor, and he wanted more details. And basically, he wanted, I remember him asking me about if I had heard Meredith scream. And I told him that I couldn't remember hearing Meredith scream. And he then went on to say, well, how could you not have heard Meredith scream? And so I said, I guess I must have heard Meredith scream, and I don't remember it.
Again, this is a logically connecting the dots thing. Well, you said you were there. Okay, well, if you were there, how could you not have heard the scream if you were so close?
Right.
Right?
So he then types up this statement. That's the 5:45 a.m. statement that I signed. Now, shortly after this, at a certain point, they take me into a different room to strip me and take photographs of my body. Presumably, they say to check to see if there was any sexual assault done to me. So they have this like male doctor checking my genitals, taking pictures of my body parts. And so that's when I was let out of that room. At a certain point, they also took me down to get something to eat finally. And it was in the stairwell, actually, that Rita Ficara, the detective who had slapped me, like as we were walking down to get something to eat, she sort of explained to me that she was trying to help me by slapping me. She was trying to like trigger my memory by slapping me in the back of the head, like explaining herself. And anyway, so
when during this period is your phone on the table and it's ringing and your mom is calling?
this is, I believe, between the two statements that I signed.
So your mom has landed in Italy. She wants to come help you. And
I can't answer the phone.
The police won't let you answer the phone.
Yeah. And that was torture because I knew my mom was arriving and that if I didn't answer my phone, she would probably think something horrible had happened to me. And I was not allowed to answer. So
why do you think they didn't let you answer?
Well, for the same reason that they didn't want me to have contact with my mom if she arrived. If she would arrived, she would have been there to support me.
You were vulnerable and they wanted to keep you vulnerable.
Yeah, I mean, yes. And if you think of it from the police officer's point of view, adding one other person who might have some interest in what happens to me only complicates things for them. It's much easier to interrogate me when I am just listening to them as the authority figure. If there's another authority figure who might be giving contradictory information or like advice, then that's going to go against their wishes. So after all of this happened, while I was still in the police office, but before they brought me to prison, I tried to talk to the police and say that I couldn't be a witness. So my understanding of the situation at this time was that I was considered a witness. That's what the police told me I was. They never told me that I was a suspect. They said, you're a witness, you're a victim. We just need you to testify in court about what this horrible person who killed Meredith, what they did. And after they stopped yelling at me, I started to process what was happening to me. I tried to remember this thing that I was supposed to be remembering with time. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it was not a memory. What I had just signed these statements about was not a memory. It was stuff that like my mind came up with to make sense of what they were telling me, but it was not real. The more and more I remember, like I more thought about it, the more I realized that it was all just a big mistake. And I tried to explain that to the police that were monitoring me, but they were not interested in hearing what I had to say. So I asked eventually for a piece of paper to write down what I was trying to say.
We could tell you all the great reasons you should support Labyrinths on Patreon, including ad-free episodes and exclusive patron-only content. But why not hear it direct from a listener?
Hi, my name is Allie, and I joined Labyrinth's Patreon because there's nowhere else that you can explore the ebbs and the flows of humanity with the kind of truth and grace that you can get with Labyrinths. There really isn't anywhere else you can get that.
Visit patreon.com/Knox Robinson.
So you asked for a piece of paper to write down this statement, and we're going to come to that statement. But in the meantime, they've gone out in the middle of the night, and they've roused Patrick Lumumba. They've kicked in his door or something.
Yeah.
Right? And they've arrested him.
Scare the crap out of him and his wife and baby.
And they're like, we got the murderer. This is, a few days after Meredith has been killed. None of the forensic evidence has come back from the lab. And
yeah, they have no proof of anything.
So later on, you are charged not just with Meredith's murder, but you are charged with slander against Patrick Lumumba, because 2 weeks after this event, when the forensic evidence does come back, it identifies a single person, Rudy Guede. His fingerprints are in Meredith's blood, his footprints, his DNA is in and on her body. He admits to being at the scene. He immediately fled the country for Germany and assumed a false identity. When he was contacted via a friend with the police listening in, he admitted that you had nothing to do with it, etc. So they know it's Rudy 2 weeks in. And the police, who have already announced case closed, we got the guy, it's Patrick, they kind of quietly let Patrick go and introduce Rudy to the media. Oh, here's the real guy, it's Rudy, right? But in the meantime, Patrick has been held in custody for 2 weeks, and his life has been turned upside down. His bar that he ran was closed. That eventually led to the shuttering of his business. It was a traumatic and destabilizing event for him. You are blamed for that event.
Yes, because the police say that those statements I signed were voluntary and spontaneous. So I just came to them and made these statements voluntarily.
Just out of the blue.
Out of the blue, I show up and start making crazy.
Like you waltz in there and say, it's Patrick.
Yeah. They do not claim any responsibility for coercing me or denying me my right to an attorney or to an official interpreter. They deny having physically abused me. So they say that I was fully within my right mind when I made those statements, and I made them intentionally and with knowledge that I was criminally slandering somebody who I knew to be innocent.
And of course, they don't admit or acknowledge that they're the ones who brought Patrick's name into the conversation and insisted for hours that you must know something about him.
Right.
Right. So I want to just pause on that, what happened to Patrick, for a minute, because even if you had done what they say you had done, a spontaneous declaration, even if you were coming up with a person to try and throw suspicion off of you, which is what your haters out there say to this day, what would a competent police force do in that scenario? I think they would, when faced with that accusation, check to see if it has any merit, right? They would go question Patrick and see what he says and see if his story matches up with your story. And when they find that he has an alibi the very next morning, they wouldn't detain him for 2 weeks when he has a rock-solid alibi. And I find it very interesting that you are blamed still for that 2 weeks of disturbance that Patrick dealt with, when the police had every reason to let him go a day later when his alibi came forward. But they didn't. So you've been held accountable for Patrick's suffering, and you've been called a liar, and you didn't receive any sort of vindication for that until 2019.
Right.
What happened in 2019?
In 2019, I appealed this conviction to the European Court of Human Rights. Now, what does that mean? The European Court of Human Rights can't overturn convictions in Italy, but what it can do is sanction Italy for denying people their human rights. And I made the argument to the European Court of Human Rights that because I was denied a right to an attorney and my right to an interpreter, those interrogations were illegal and had violated my human rights. And the European Court of Human Rights came back in favor of that interpretation. So they vindicated me and they sanctioned Italy. Now, that didn't overturn my conviction in Italy, but it was my only, at that time, avenue of vindication, because in Italy, that conviction for slander was considered definitive and was not appealable.
Interestingly, though, even in Italy, those interrogations were ruled illegal, right?
Right.
From the very beginning.
Yes, from the very beginning, it was a judge recognized that my right to an attorney and to an interpreter was violated. And so those statements could not be used as evidence against me for the murder charge. However, she said that they could be used against me for the slander charge, and that the jury that was to hear this as evidence was supposed to disregard it.
Yeah, the
when
same
it came
jury.
to, the same jury is hearing all of these charges being brought against me and is informed that they cannot use this as a piece of evidence to consider when it comes to the murder charge, only when it comes to the slander charge. So they're supposed to somehow forget about it when they're thinking about
Right.
whether or not they think I'm guilty of murder.
And of course, this is your word against the police's word here, because rather conveniently, though they recorded every other interaction with you, this final night when they gaslit you into submission, they did not tape any of this.
Right. Supposedly there's no record of
Or they
no
conveniently
recording.
lost that record.
Right. They
Yeah.
say that they didn't turn the tape recorder on
Yeah.
because of, I think they said funding issues, that they couldn't afford to turn on the recording device at that time.
Okay, so you're convicted of slander, 2019, European court vindicates you. They award you a small amount of money. And it seems like there's no further vindication
It seems
coming.
like that's going to be it. However, the Italy Innocence Project was working on trying to pass a new reform in Italy that would basically allow for cases that were considered definitive in Italy to be reopened in light of international courts' rulings. And that my case was a sort of perfect example of this, where I was convicted of this charge, but the European Court of Human Rights ruled in my favor. And so that would allow that case to be reopened in Italy. And that law was passed in Italy. And then we made, together with the Italy Innocence Project, they took my case on and brought it to the Supreme Court in Italy, which ruled in October 2023 that, yes, my rights had been violated, and they overturned the conviction, and then they sent me back for retrial. So when we say that this whole long saga is not over yet, it is because I am a defendant again. I am still on trial. I am going to go to trial sometime in 2024, very likely, for this slander charge.
You will likely have to go to Italy and testify.
Yes. And the interesting thing, though, about it is this time the Supreme Court made a very specific change to what is considered evidence against me for this charge. Initially, what was evidence against me for this charge was the 1:45 a.m. statement that I signed, the 5:45 a.m. statement that I signed, and the handwritten statement that I wrote and gave to the police following these things. And the court ruled that in light of the European Court of Human Rights ruling that I was not allowed an interpreter and I was not allowed a lawyer, those statements that I signed, the 1:45 a.m. and the 5:45 a.m., cannot be used as evidence against me. The only thing that can be used as evidence is the handwritten statement that I wrote in the aftermath. This is potentially where it might be a good idea for me to read this statement.
Yeah, read it. This is what you hand wrote a few hours after
being gaslit to death.
Being gaslit into submission. Yeah.
All right. All of this is very strange, I know. But really what has happened is just as confusing to me as it is to everyone else. I have been told there is hard evidence saying that I was at the place of the murder of my friend when it happened. This, I want to confirm, is something that, to me, if asked a few days ago, would be impossible. I know that Raffaele has placed evidence against me, saying I left him during the night of Meredith's murder. But let me tell you this. In my mind, there are things I remember and things that are confused. My account of the story goes as follows, despite the evidence stacked against me. Thursday, November 1st, I saw Meredith the last time at my house when she left around 3 or 4 in the afternoon. Raffaele was with me at the time. We, Raffaele and I, stayed at my house for a little while longer, and around 5 in the evening we left to watch the movie Amélie at his house. After the movie, I received a message from Patrick, for whom I work at the pub Le Chic. He told me in this message that it wasn't necessary for me to come into work for the evening because there was no one at my work. I also remember now sending the message, Ci vediamo, buona serata, back to him. And this to me doesn't mean I would meet with him immediately, especially since I said buona serata. So this is me responding to the fact that the police were saying this message, Ci vediamo, buona serata, suggests that I met with Patrick. And I'm explaining, no, that's not what I meant. What I meant was, I'll see you whenever.
Yeah,
have a good night.
This is you improperly translating the English idiom, see you later, into Italian, and them reading that as a literal appointment to see someone later.
Yes. All right. So continuing with the statement. What happened next, I know doesn't match up with what Raffaele was saying, but this is what I remember. I told Raffaele that I didn't have to work and that I could remain at home for the evening. After that, I believe we relaxed in his room together. Perhaps I checked my email, perhaps I read or studied, or perhaps I made love to Raffaele. In fact, I think I did make love with him. However, I admit that this period of time is rather strange because I'm not quite sure. I smoked marijuana with him, and I might have even fallen asleep. These things I'm not sure about, and I know they are important both to the case and to help myself. But in reality, I don't think I did much.
Can I pause you right there?
Yeah.
I want to just nail down into this. You know, I know Raffaele has placed evidence against me. Can you just elaborate what actually was true and what you believed in that moment?
So what I was told in that moment was that Raffaele said that I was not with him the night that Meredith was murdered, that I was with him in the evening, but that I left at a certain point and didn't come back until around like 1 a.m. or something. I don't even think that they were that specific. I just think he said I left and I came back later. And that's all I knew. And I actually didn't really know what had happened until I read Raffaele's book years later, where he said that they were berating him and gaslighting him and threatening him. And eventually he said that, well, after he went to sleep, maybe I left. And that afterward what he did say, which is not great, but which is what the police coerced him into saying, is that I asked him to lie for me. So they tell me that Raffaele says I left. And this whole perhaps I read or perhaps I made love to Raffaele, this is really painful for me to read because the police had totally gaslit me and made me feel like everything that I thought I remembered about that night was not real.
You're still in the fog of this.
Of being gaslit, yes. Because I remembered, I told them, we had dinner, we watched a movie, we read a book.
But they've also then nitpicked every little, exactly, was it 5:45 p.m.?
Yes.
5:47 p.m.?
They nitpicked all of my memories to make me sort of doubt all of them. And so I was feeling, completely disoriented and not sure what was real anymore and confusing one night with another. Anyway, so to go on with the narrative. One thing I do remember is that I took a shower with Raffaele, and this may explain how we passed the time. In truth, I don't remember exactly what day this was, but I do remember we showered and cleaned ourselves for a long time. He took care to clean my ears and dry and brush my hair. In regards to things I know for sure happened the night Meredith was murdered was that Raffaele and I ate fairly late. I thought around 11 in the evening, although I can't be sure because I didn't look at the clock. After dinner, I noticed a little blood on Raffaele's hand, but I was under the impression that it was blood from the fish. After we ate, Raffaele washed the dishes, but the pipes under his sink broke and water flooded the floor. But because we didn't have a mop, I said we could clean it up tomorrow because we, Meredith, Laura, Filomena, and I, have a mop at home. I remember it was quite late because we were both very tired, though I can't say the time. Again, this is me being They wanted to know exactly what time, and I just couldn't remember.
Right. And it's like, what a weird detail to mention about blood from a fish. It's like, well, because I'm assuming,
were asking me about blood.
Yeah.
Yeah. The next thing I remember was waking up the morning of Friday, November 2nd, around 10 a.m., and I took a plastic bag to bring back dirty clothes to go back to my house. It was then I arrived home alone that I found the door to my house wide open, and this all began. In regards to this, quote, confession that I made last night, I want to make clear that I'm very doubtful of the verity of my statements because they were made under the pressure of stress, shock, and extreme exhaustion. Not only was I told I would be arrested and put in jail for 30 years, but I was also hit in the head when I didn't remember a fact correctly. I understand the police are under a lot of stress, so I understand the treatment I received.
Boy, talk about Stockholm Syndrome.
Yeah, well, let's remember that I had just been screamed at by these authorities all night long, and I was also giving them this statement. Like, I was at their mercy, and I was trying to say, like, I've been abused, but, I
understand why you had to hit me.
I understand why you had to hit me. Please don't be mad at me. Like, I was literally like, please don't be mad at me. Like, I was so scared of them at this point that I was just like, I'm trying, like, I was trying to cooperate. Anyway, so continuing. However, it was under this pressure and after many hours of confusion that my mind came up with these answers. In my mind, I saw Patrick in flashes of blurred images. I saw him near the basketball court. I saw him at my front door. I saw myself cowering in the kitchen with my hands over my ears because in my head I could hear Meredith screaming. But I've said this many times so as to make myself clear. These things seem unreal to me, like a dream, and I am unsure if they are real things that happened or are just dreams my mind has made to try to answer the questions in my head and the questions I am being asked. But the truth is, I am unsure about the truth, and here's why. 1. The police have told me that they have hard evidence that proves I was in the house, my house, at the time of Meredith's murder. I don't know what this proof is, but if it's true, then it means I am very confused and my dreams must be true. So the police lied to me, told me they had hard evidence of me being at the house, and I'm like, how is that even possible? 2. My boyfriend has claimed that I have said things that I know are not true. I know I told him I didn't have to work that night. I remember that moment very clearly. I also never asked him to lie for me. This is absolutely a lie. So Raffaele apparently said, and they told me that I had to work at night. So
Yeah.
I left to work, but I did not say that to him. And that I asked him to lie for me, which I did not say. All right, continuing. What I don't understand is why Raffaele, who has always been so caring and gentle with me, would lie about this. What does he have to hide? I don't think he killed Meredith, but I do think he is scared like me. He walked into a situation he never had to be in, and perhaps he is trying to find a way out by disassociating himself with me. Honestly, I understand, because this is a very scary situation. Again, me sort of like empathizing with Raffaele even as I'm like, what the fuck is going on?
Mm-hmm.
I also know that the police don't believe things of me that I know I can explain, such as, 1, I know the police are confused as to why it took me so long to call someone after I found the door to my house open and blood in the bathroom. The truth is, I wasn't sure what to think, but I definitely didn't think the worst, that someone was murdered. I thought a lot of things, mainly that perhaps someone got hurt and left quickly to take care of it. I also thought that maybe one of my roommates was having menstrual problems and hadn't cleaned it up. Perhaps I was in shock, but at the time I didn't know what to think, and that's the truth. That is why I talked to Raffaele about it in the morning, because I was worried and wanted advice. 2. I also know that the fact that I can't fully recall the events I claim took place at Raffaele's home during the time that Meredith was murdered is incriminating. I stand by my statements that I made last night about events that could have taken place in my home with Patrick, but I want to make very clear that these events seem more unreal to me than what I said before, that I stayed at Raffaele's house. So again, like, they were picking apart my memories of being at Raffaele's house, asking me to timestamp everything and trying to basically make it seem like I had a big hole of missing time that I couldn't account for. And that's what that number 2
I think we're going to come
about.
back to this. Let's keep reading, but I think this is kind of the crucial moment here, but we'll come back to that.
3. I am very confused at this time. My head is full of contrasting ideas, and I know I can be frustrating to work with for this reason. But I also want to tell the truth as best I can. Everything I have said in regards to my involvement in Meredith's death, though contrasting, are the best truth that I have been able to think. Think of it this way. What am I supposed to think has happened when what I think is really true about myself and what I have done is told to me to be a lie? At first, I was scared, offended, and confused. But as time, shock, and panic came on, I began to think of other explanations. And it is because I have to think in this way that I feel so at contrast with myself. There's one thing that I think in myself is true, but there's another possibility that could be true, and I can't honestly think for sure what is what. I'm trying, I really am, because I'm scared for myself. I know I didn't kill Meredith. That's all I know for sure. In these flashbacks that I'm having, I see Patrick as the murderer, but the way the truth feels in my mind, there is no way for me to have known, because I don't remember for sure if I was at my house that night. The questions that need answering, at least for how I'm thinking, are: 1, why did Raffaele lie? Or, for you, did Raffaele lie? 2, why did I think of Patrick? 3, is the evidence proving my presence at the time and place of the crime reliable? If so, what does this say about my memory? Is it reliable? 4, is there any other evidence condemning Patrick or any other person? 3, back again to 3, who is the real murderer? This is particularly important because I don't feel I can be used as a condemning testimony in this instance. I have a clearer mind than I had before, but I'm still missing parts, which I know is bad for me, but this is the truth, and this is what I'm thinking at this time. Please don't yell at me, because it only makes me more confused, which doesn't help anyone. I understand how serious this situation is, but as such, I want to give you this information as soon and as clearly as possible. If there are still parts that don't make sense, please ask me. I'm doing the best I can, just like you are. Please believe me at least in that, although I understand if you don't. All I know is I didn't kill Meredith, so I have nothing but lies to be afraid of.
This just hurts me. This hurts my heart. You're so broken in this moment.
Yeah.
You're so broken, and you're trying to help them. You're apologizing for the abuse that they've given you, and you're trying to help them. Oof. So that number 2 up above, I stand by my statements that I made last night about events that could have taken place in my home with Patrick. I think it's really interesting that you say that could have taken place, because you're, even as much as they gaslit you and sort of mentally broke you, you're still viewing all of that as like some hypothetical that
Right.
you don't really remember. And then you say, but I want to make very clear that these events seem more unreal to me than what I said before, that I stayed at Raffaele's house. That, I think, is, to my mind, a pretty clear recantation, right? You do say down below,
In these flashbacks that I'm having, I see Patrick as the murderer, but the way the truth feels in my mind, there is no way for me to have known.
mhm,
And this is like me. So this is me of basically trying to be like, I know I signed these statements. I know that this is what we've all now said is the thing, but I'm saying it's not the thing.
Yeah.
It's basically what I'm saying with this. Obviously, Patrick's attorney feels that what I was saying was Patrick was the murderer, which is not what I was attempting to say.
I mean, you do say, I stand by my statements that I made last night, right? Which is interesting. I mean, even in this moment, the language you're using, you've internalized that you made those statements. And that,
Well, and what
you
I was
know,
trying to say by that was I wasn't lying. Like, I wasn't lying when I said that what could have taken place in my home could have happened. I'm not lying about it. I'm not lying to you.
mhm,
But what I'm telling you is that even while I'm telling you in good faith that I think these things could have happened, they seem unreal to me. That was what I was like. They spent those hours yelling at me, telling me that I was a liar. And I kept trying to say, I'm not lying to you. I'm not lying to you. And so I felt compelled to reiterate, like, I'm not lying. Like, I really I really, truly am confused and believe that these things could have happened. But I don't know what the truth is anymore because you scared the living shit out of me, and I don't know.
Yeah. The questions that you say you need answering, I think, are really interesting because they're the kind of questions that the police should have been asking themselves. You know, what did Raffaele lie? Right? Is the evidence proving my presence at the crime scene reliable? And in fact, no, they didn't have that evidence.
Yeah.
It didn't exist. What does this say about my memory? Is it reliable? You know, they should have been asking themselves that. Is there any other evidence condemning Patrick? No. You know, this is all stuff that could have prevented Patrick's life being turned upside down if the police had just looked at the questions you had put there. Even saying, who is the real murderer? Obviously, that implies it's not Patrick.
Yeah.
Right? So this statement that you wrote is the only piece of evidence that is going to be used against you to try and convict you of slander in this upcoming trial.
Yes.
Do you think that's a good thing?
I mean, yes, it's better than more. I mean, obviously, I'm going to be asked to explain this statement, and I'm going to be asked to go over in excruciating detail. What did you mean by blah, 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 blah? And it's not going to be pleasant, but I feel confident that the intention of this document is very clear. That what I'm saying is I cannot testify against Patrick, and that I don't know what is real or what's not real. And I'm, doing everything I can to make sense of how I was treated and mistreated during that interrogation process. So I feel confident that if someone came to this with an open mind, they would see very clearly what my intention was with this statement. And it was not to implicate an innocent man who I knew to be innocent.
Yeah. I'm optimistic.
You're optimistic? Yeah, well, it's still Italy, though. Not anything against Italy. It's because these things happen everywhere. But it's like, I don't know. I'm so wary. After I was convicted, I lost faith that reason would ultimately win out. And so I don't know for sure that reason will win out this time either. I hope so. I think that if reason is employed, then I should win out. But is that what's going to be the thing that wins the day? Like, I don't know.
You're also going up against just 15 years of character assassination here. And one thing that may interestingly affect this is the recent news of Rudy Guede.
Yeah, so the person who actually murdered Meredith, Rudy Guede, he spent 13 years in prison, was released, and apparently started dating this much younger woman, 23 years old.
This is news that just came out last week.
And 6 months into their relationship, or actually 6 months into his freedom, I don't know how long into their relationship, he started physically and psychologically abusing her.
And sexually
abusing her. So she has claimed that he manipulated her, raped her, physically assaulted her, and he is now he's being investigated and standing trial. He's had a, what do they call that?
Ankle bracelet.
Yeah, he has an ankle bracelet on him. He has a restraining order against him. And
he's facing charges of domestic violence and sexual assault, I guess.
Yeah.
So, one of the great tragedies of this whole case is that the man who killed Meredith was never fully held responsible.
Right.
And he was convicted of the rape.
Yes, he was convicted of raping Meredith and of participating in the murder, but not being the one who instigated the murder or who actually stabbed Meredith to death.
And there are some interesting speculations about why the Peruvian authorities seemed so eager to let him off the hook, right? But that aside, he was convicted and sentenced to 30 years, reduced to 16 on appeal, let out after 13 for good behavior. And he has defenders in Italy and some abroad as well from Italy. who think that he got shafted and that he was only accused because he's the black guy, and that it really was Amanda and Raffaele, and they let this poor immigrant take the blame for them. When in reality, of course, Rudy has blamed Amanda and continues to blame Amanda in Freedom.
Yeah, let's talk about actual criminal slander.
Yeah. So what a sad thing that he's now been able to harm another woman. But is it possible, you think, that this might open some people's eyes to think, gosh, it was this guy?
I mean, I do think that he's showing his stripes, as they say. And I think my impression is that people are noticing. I feel really bad for this girl. I'm glad that she's alive because she was able to, I mean, maybe Rudy Guede was rehabilitated enough to not murder women, just physically assault them and sexually abuse them. But the fact that she shacked up with a guy who raped and murdered a young girl her exact age and she's living to tell the tale is good. I mean, I'm glad that she is here to tell the tale. So
even if you get justice here, you get vindicated of this slander charge, is it over then? Is Italy over at that point?
I mean, legally, it would be, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, legally, it's still not resolved in a way if Rudy has never been held fully accountable.
Yeah, that's true. But I don't know if there's anything that can be done about that. I think that there is no international court that found him more guilty than Italy did. And so I think that, unfortunately, Italy let him off the hook. And there's nothing really that can be done about it.
What is it like for you 15 years later to still be poring over the events of that night, of that interrogation? How does it make you feel?
I don't love it. Well, one, it was the worst thing that's ever happened to me. It's the only time I've ever felt truly insane. And I'm now still triggered by it. Like whenever I feel like somebody's not being honest with me or is trying to manipulate me, is trying to gaslight me, I get very, very scared and I react very strongly, even to something that's little, like a small version of that. So I'm still obviously traumatized by the experience. And I still feel like when I have to explain it, it's because people don't believe me. And I'm horrified that no one will ever believe me and that I will always have this horrible thing that happened to me held against me. In the way that I imagine a woman who is raped is blamed for being a slut or for having she was asking for it because of what she was wearing. You weren't really raped because look at you. And I feel like in the same way that it would make a woman crazy for going through that, that's how I feel I'm made to be blamed and made to feel crazy for it. So I don't know. I mean, on the one hand, I'm glad I have this chance to clear my name, and hopefully that will take away the stigma that I've been living with. And on the other hand, I don't know if it ever will, in the way that it doesn't. I'm still traumatized by it, and I'm sure people will still hold it against me because they don't want to understand what happened, and they don't want to accept that an innocent person could be gaslit and coerced into what I went through, you know?
What do you think about the girl who wrote that statement? How do you feel thinking about that 20-year-old girl?
Oh, God, I feel sick reading it because I know I remember what was happening at that time. Like, I remember how scared I was and how confused I was. And I'm now a mom. I'm like holding our son right now as he's asleep in my arms. And I just wish my mom could have been there for me because I was just bullied into submission by authority figures who I thought I could trust. And I blamed myself for so much of what had happened, in part because I was afraid of them and in part because I didn't know what else to think. I was 20 years old and I had no idea what had just happened to me. Now I know. I see what happened to me. I see it. But at the time I was so confused and I didn't understand, and I just feel so bad for myself. Like, I wish I could go back and comfort her and let her know.
Yeah, what would you tell her?
That it's not her fault. It's not her fault what happened. And that what was happening to her was not fair. And that someone was going to come and make it better. And that's the only thing I don't know if that's true. I don't know if anyone's going to come in and make it better for her.
Even now?
Even now. I mean, we're trying, but no one should have to go through that. That's why I care so much about changing laws and making it so that police can't lie to people who are being interrogated, and that they have to record interrogation so there's actual evidence of what happened. Because these kinds of things that happen behind closed doors, it's fucking brutal. And it's so unfair and it's so unjust, and it just screws up a case that was very straightforward, that never should have been confusing to anyone.
Yeah. Okay.
Huh.
I think you need to go meditate, huh?
Yeah, I'm going to go meditate now. I'm going to go put this baby down and go meditate.
It's our hope that conversations like this make the hard-to-grasp problem of false confessions less opaque. Amanda is hardly alone in having been coerced by police into making false statements. Over 25% of proven DNA exonerations involve a false confession. If you want more on this subject, we highly recommend you read Duped by psychologist Saul Kassin, who is one of the world's leading authorities on the subject. He breaks down in much greater detail exactly how flawed police interrogation methods can pressure innocent people into implicating themselves, even as the police believe they are getting at the truth. And we urge you to support bills and measures to reform police interrogations, such as requirements to record them and prohibitions against using deception. In the meantime, get lost with us.
Find us on Twitter at Amanda Knox,
At ManUnderBridge,
on Instagram at AmamaKnox,
at MC Carbon.
and you can learn more about our work and how to support it at knoxrobinson.com.
Labyrinths is brought to you by Knox Robinson Productions. This episode was written and produced by us, with theme music by Josh Budo Karp.
Hello, listener. This episode of Labyrinths could be ad-free, but that requires exclusive access. Your mission, should you choose to accept it, is to become a monthly Patreon subscriber, which will grant you access to top-secret patron-only content. This podcast will self-destruct without your support.
Was that too cheesy?
Who doesn't like cheese? Visit patreon.com/KnoxRobinson.